The Levitical prohibitions. Most people know about them. Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. With a male you shall not lie as though lying with a woman. It is an abomination, something abhorrent or detestable to God. Leviticus 20:13. A man who will lie with a woman, with a male rather, literally lyings of a woman, that is as though lying with a woman. They have committed an abomination, the two of them. They shall certainly be put to death, their blood be upon them. Now, sometimes it's argued here that the use of this term, to'avah, abomination, refers merely to ritual offenses. This turns out not to be true. Anybody who actually picks up a Hebrew concordance and looks at how to'avah is used in the Old Testament will find almost invariably it's used for moral offenses, not ritual offenses, chiefly idolatry and related issues, like the use of magic in order to manipulate God, necromancy, and so forth, offering up one's child in sacrifice to other gods, another idolatrous rite. And apart from idolatry and related offenses, it's also used significantly of sexual offenses and of economic exploitation of the poor. It's very difficult to find any text that has to do with only ritual offenses. There's one text that actually uses a different term, shekutz in Hebrew rather than to'avah, that some people improperly relate to this. And then there's one other text which talks about abominable things, that is abominable foods, but it doesn't actually refer to the eating of such foods as itself an abomination. That's one text only. And the whole array of other texts that we have within the Hebrew Bible all focus primarily on sexual offenses, idolatrous offenses, and economic exploitation. None of these we regard as merely ritual offenses. So it's actually the application of the term to'avah here is part of what indicates to us that not merely ritual offenses are being talked about, but actually sexual offenses. Now, there are other arguments that can be made here for indicating why we know that the prohibitions here in Leviticus 18 and 20 refer not merely to ritual, but to moral impurities. For example, number one, they are actually explicitly called iniquity or sin in Leviticus 18:25, not merely ritual uncleanness. Also within the Old Testament, in these prohibitions in Leviticus 18 and 20, they do not permit absolution merely through ritual acts. If you commit a ritual offense, you're defiled through some sort of ritual impurity, then it can be rectified by ritual acts, offering of sacrifice, bathing, passage of time. But in the case of the sexual offenses in Leviticus 18, things like incest, adultery, man-male intercourse, and bestiality, these offenses cannot be rectified by ritual acts. They are regarded as capital offenses. These prohibitions also do not penalize persons without willful intent. In Leviticus 20, it says repeatedly with these offenses, their blood be upon them, which is a way of saying, you know what you were doing, this was consensual, you're going to be held culpable for the act. In the case of ritual impurities, you're held culpable irrespective of whether you intended to do it or not. If you're held, for example, impure, if you come into contact with a corpse, doesn't matter what your intent was. That's not an act of moral culpability. It's an act of ritual culpability. So you've got to perform a sacrifice, you've got to bathe, and you've got to have a passage of time to go by. But it's not something that you need to personally repent for because you came into contact with the corpse inadvertently. Same thing with discharge, even in the act of sexual intercourse. That's an impurity, which gives the woman time to rest after the sexual act, but it's not a sin. It's something that happens naturally in the course of sexual intercourse and is not something for which you're penalized as a moral offense. These offenses of sex laws in Leviticus 18 and 20 are only talking about willful offenses because they are regarded not merely as ritual impurity, but moral impurity. Also, unlike many ritual impurities, this isn't something contagious by touch. You don't catch adultery. You don't catch incest. You don't catch homosexual practice. You don't catch bestiality as if by coming into contact with the person who's engaged in the behavior, you now become corrupted. But with a lot of ritual impurity offenses, that's what happens. You're contagious by touch. You touch a leper, you're contagious. Doesn't matter whether or not you contract leprosy or not. This is regarded as a ritual offense. But none of the offenses in Leviticus 18 and 20 that are sexual offenses are contagious by touch. In fact, too, they also include an implicit rationale for the prohibition, each one of them. For example, with incest. The whole rubric beginning in Leviticus 18:6, introducing the incest law, says you shall not have sex with the flesh of your own flesh. That has an implicit moral rationale for not having incest. Why don't you have sex with members who are close kin? Because the whole purpose of sexual intercourse is to become of one flesh with somebody you're not already of the same flesh with. That is somebody who is a complementary other on the level of kinship, not somebody who is already in a close kin family member, but somebody who is unlike you on the level of kinship, a kinship other, if you will. Same thing with an implicit rationale of homosexual practice in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. Again, you shall not lie with another male as though lying with a woman. That is, you don't treat another man as your sexual counterpart or complement in an act of sexual intercourse, because that man is not a sexual complement to yourself. He's your same sex. So the fact that we have implicit rationales in the prohibition indicate that we're not talking merely about ritual offenses. These are moral offenses. Moreover, we know that in the context of Leviticus 17 and 18, there are prohibitions that apply not just to Jews, but also to resident aliens or Gentiles as well. So that fact indicates it's a moral prohibition, not merely a ritual Jewish offense. In addition to that, these offenses are picked up in the New Testament as well. Again, they're not merely ceremonial in their offense, but like the offenses of incest, of bestiality, of adultery, these offenses are regarded as moral offenses that even when Old Testament law is jettisoned, they still are regarded as against God's will in the New Testament. So for those 7 reasons, to regard the homosexual practice as a merely ritual offense, when we don't treat incest the same way in the same text, or adultery, or bestiality, is just not paying attention to the historical context. Let's talk about the argument also about, well, why not make them like cloth mixtures, or the menstrual law, or the sowing 2 different kinds of seed in the harvest? Isn't there some sort of quaint ritual law of this sort? Again, if we look at the contextual evidence, it isn't. There's no comparison as regards the severity of the offense. What's the penalty for mixing 2 different types of cloth together in the Old Testament? Probably no more than the destruction of the cloth, because we know in Deuteronomy 22, when it forbids the sowing of 2 different kinds of seed in the same field, what is the penalty for that? Simply the destruction of the harvest. Nothing like the severity of the sexual offenses that are given in Leviticus 18 and 20, which are regarded as capital offenses. Even sex with a menstruant, which is mentioned in Leviticus 18 and 20, is regarded as a second-tier offense. When we get to Leviticus 20, which prioritizes the sexual offenses according to what is most severe, the offense with having sex with a menstruating woman is put on the second tier of offenses. In the first tier is adultery, having sex with the closest kins that you have, namely with parent or with child, and bestiality. None of these we regard as offenses that we can do away with today in a new covenant period. There's also no comparison as regards the absoluteness of the prohibition and the degree to which it's symbolic. We know that cloth mixtures are not a major problem in ancient Israel because they actually permit and even enjoin cloth mixtures in some contexts. For example, tabernacle cloths often have include a mixture of different types of cloth. Parts of the priestly wardrobe and the tassel worn by the lady involve a mixture of cloth. Well, why do they allow the mixture of cloth in those venues but not in these other contexts? Because cloth mixture is a symbol. It symbolizes the special intersecting of the divine realm with the human, which is inappropriate in non-sacral contexts. So there is a place in which the divine human realm intersects. It's at the tabernacle. It's in connection with the priest. And it's in the setting off of the laity in relation to the rest of the world. In those contexts, it's appropriate to talk about the intersection of the divine realm with the human. In other places involved in normal or mundane activity, there is no intersection of the divine realm with the human in Israelite context. So the prohibition of cloth mixtures is a way of making that point. There's no symbolic element to the prohibition of homosexual practice any more than the prohibition of incest is simply symbolic. You're really not to engage in the incest. You're really not to engage in the homosexual practice. And take also the issue of sex with a menstruant. The only sexual offense in Leviticus 18 and 20 that elsewhere in Leviticus overlaps with permitted ritual impurities is the prohibition of sex with a menstruant. The main issue there is the interaction of the fluids, not the legitimacy of the sexual union per se. Sex with a menstruant doesn't approach the degree of unnaturalness that you have in terms of incest or man-male sex or bestiality, since sex with a menstruant can happen inadvertently in the course of any normal sexual activity. So we get clues even from the Old Testament itself that the best parallel to prohibition of homosexual practice in Leviticus is not sex with a menstruant. It's not the mixture of clots or mixture of seeds, but it's rather with incest and with bestiality and with adultery.
Many of you preached on marriage on June the 9th, Sunday. Thank you for doing that. There were thousands of pastors across America that participated. Thank you for doing that. But you're not too late. If you could not, for some reason, preach on marriage on that particular Sunday, pastors, go right ahead and pick a Sunday sometime very soon, whenever it's convenient for you. Some of you were in sermon series and couldn't break in at that time. Others of you didn't even know about this movement, pulpitfreedom.org. Pulpitfreedom.org is the place to sign up to be a part of this avalanche of truth we're spreading across America. As much as we can, we'd like to be before the Supreme Court announces its verdict on Prop 8 or on DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act. But even if you come after that announcement, by all means do that. Why, Pastor? Is because you have the ultimate last word. That is, God does. You really don't, but God does. God invented marriage, not the Supreme Court, not a state legislature, not the federal government. Marriage was designed by God from the beginning. You know how the Bible begins in Genesis with the marriage of a male and a female, and it ends in Revelation with the wedding of a bride and a groom. And in between, Jesus says in Matthew 19, we're created male and female, quoting from Genesis. And the two complementary halves of humanity come together. And what God has put together is two become one. What God has put together, let no one rip apart. In other words, what God has defined as marriage, no court, no legislator, not even the voting public can redefine. So you, pastor, as a spokesperson for God, you have the final word. You are representing the final authority. You're representing the ultimate chief justice of the universe. So even though that June 9th date passed that many of us chose to preach on marriage, you're not too late. Jump right in. Pick a Sunday. Sign up at pulpitfreedom.org. Pulpitfreedom.org. Sign up there and join the avalanche of truth being released across America that helps explain the definition of marriage. By the way, anytime the government has a vested interest in trying to redefine marriage, there are three casualties that are sacrificed at that altar. One is personal freedoms. The second one is parental rights. And the third is religious liberty. The radical homosexual agenda of redefining a marriage and religious liberties cannot coexist in the same culture at the same time. There's two locomotives. They're headed at each other at full speed. One will survive when the day's over. Either the radical homosexual agenda of redefining marriage or religious liberty. Not both can coexist in the same country at the same time. One of the high-level officials in the Obama administration has said the radical homosexual agenda, they're using other words than this, they were saying civil rights of homosexuals to redefine marriage is so important it trumps the First Amendment. It trumps all religious liberty. They cannot coexist, we would tell you, in the same nation. So you have the opportunity to spread the truth of God's Word. Let's join together, all preach on the topic of marriage at approximately the same time. So select a date. Pulpitfreedom.org is the place to sign up. Thank you so much for doing that.